Hello, everyone. Today, we'll analyze how the first use of Alabuga fried all the digital components of NATO equipment, why the effectiveness of the praised Patriot plummeted from the advertised 90% to a real 6%. By the end, you'll understand why shielding didn't save the equipment, how Moscow outsmarted the Western strategy, and the cost of dependence on GPS. Stay until the end. There's a classified U.S. Army report that calls Russia the most difficult adversary in history. First, it's important to understand the principle of the weapon in question. According to open data and reports from several Russian sources, Alabuga is an electromagnetic munition designed not to kill people, but to disable equipment. Its task is to generate a pulse of such power that all electronics in a given area simply cease to function. The mechanics of the process are described quite simply. The munition is delivered to the target, usually by a missile, and detonated at a calculated altitude. At the moment of detonation, a special charge creates a super-powerful electromagnetic pulse. This wave spreads around at the speed of light and penetrates any electronic devices within range. Then begins what modern military equipment designers fear most. Microchips receive an instantaneous voltage surge that they are not designed for. Thin tracks burn out. Transistors break down. Controllers and processors turn into a set of useless crystals. Device memory, according to experts, is often erased without a chance of recovery. The product is outwardly intact, but the electronic components are gone. It's a passive piece of metal and plastic. According to available estimates, it is extremely difficult to completely shield against such a pulse. Yes, shielding with some metals helps partially, but complete protection requires heavy, solid housings, complex filters, and a mass margin, which contradicts the entire logic of modern equipment. Most models were created with a priority on lightness and compactness, and a significant part of the protection against such a pulse was sacrificed to weight and cost. The result? High vulnerability. The range of such a munition, according to open sources, is measured in kilometers and depends on the power of the charge and the altitude of detonation. If the pulse is generated at a certain altitude, the kill zone increases, covering an area comparable to a small city or a large defense hub. One strike is enough to simultaneously shut down an entire sector of equipment. At the same time, the topic of Alabuga remained in the shadows for many years. Russian electromagnetic weapons programs were mentioned in reports by Western think tanks, but details were scarce. Intelligence reports spoke of developments, but no one showed the public the real characteristics, tests, and production volumes. NATO knew about the potential of the direction, but did not understand when and in what form these developments could enter the battlefield. Analysts have repeatedly emphasized that such weapons change the rules of the game too much to be introduced into battle without extreme necessity. One real combat episode automatically reveals a lot of technical details. The enemy gets the opportunity to study the consequences, develop protective measures, and change equipment standards. Therefore, according to experts, such systems are kept until the stakes are really high. According to reports from several military sources, such a moment for Russia came when Ukrainian forces, saturated with Western electronics, were preparing active operations in an important sector of the line of combat contact. According to the Western press, an entire network of NATO communications, command posts, guidance systems, and reconnaissance was concentrated in this area. In fact, a compact but very smart group was being assembled there. It was this zone, according to Russian commentators, that was struck by electromagnetic munitions. The charge was delivered by missiles and detonated at an optimal altitude, calculated to capture the maximum part of the communications and control hub. The pulse covered dozens of square kilometers, where communications equipment, radars, fire control systems, and high-precision equipment were located at that time. According to descriptions from both sides, events unfolded rapidly within seconds, and in some places almost instantly, the entire digital control loop in the impact zone went silent. Radio stations stopped communicating, radar screens went blank, weapon control terminals froze and did not reboot. Sites with electronic modules stopped responding. Navigation based on GPS and other systems disappeared. A separate blow fell on Western models. Reactive systems, such as HIMARS, tied to complex targeting computers, actually stopped. Drones either lost control and began to fall, or went into uncontrolled mode. Tanks and armored vehicles with digital sighting and stabilization devices turned into heavy machines without eyes. Artillery, which relied on digital computers, lost accuracy. According to reports from the scene, even air defense systems in the area partially shut down due to damage to the electronic components. The first minutes after the strike were a shock to the Ukrainian command. Representatives of units responsible for communications reported the simultaneous failure of almost all channels. Commanders could not understand whether it was a powerful cyber attack or a large-scale electronic warfare attack. Only later, after attempts to reboot and inspect the equipment, did it become clear that it was not jamming, but physical burnout of elements. And here, the key feature of such weapons was revealed. If in the case of conventional electronic warfare, it is enough to wait until the signal disappears, then in the case of an electromagnetic pulse, the devices are simply destroyed. They cannot be turned on again. They cannot be returned to service without replacing most of the electronic blocks. For a large group, this means not a temporary failure, but a long-term loss of combat capability. According to the Ukrainian side, conveyed to the country's leadership, an entire section of the front ended up without stable communications and normal control. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, according to media reports, reacted sharply to these reports and demanded explanations from NATO. The Kiev leader, according to sources, asked partners direct questions. Why were they not warned in advance about such weapons? Why were no protective measures provided? And why were such expensive Western complexes so vulnerable? The answers were disappointing. NATO countries themselves do not have complete protection against such exposure, and a significant part of their equipment was built with an emphasis on electronic superiority, not on resistance to such pulses. The alliance's doctrine has long relied on constant communication, precision weapons with GPS guidance, and a unified information network. An electromagnetic strike hits the very foundation of this model, temporarily turning a high-tech army into groups deprived of communication and precise eyes. In parallel, urgent calculations began in the West. Analytical centers and military departments tried to answer several questions. How many such munitions could be in the Russian arsenal? How stable is their effect? Is it possible to cheaply modify existing equipment to address such threats? And how quickly can the affected electronics be restored? According to experts, complete protection will require heavy housings, additional filters, and higher equipment costs, and mass replacement of burned-out components in a short time is almost impossible. According to American media reports, the Pentagon is urgently revising its doctrines in case of a conflict with Russia. The scenario in which the enemy is able to disable a significant part of electronic systems with one strike forces a new look at the scenarios of a major collision. Electronic superiority, which has been relied upon for decades in the presence of such munitions, ceases to be a guarantee. Meanwhile, according to Russian sources, Russian units received a window of opportunity in the affected area. Ukrainian forces, having lost stable communications and normal target designation, were forced to hastily rebuild their defenses. The withdrawal from some positions, according to reports from the line of contact, was due precisely to the impossibility of coordinating actions and calling for support. The advantage in the number of pieces of equipment with electronics ceased to matter when a significant part of this electronics failed. Thus, a new type of warfare was revealed before our eyes. Not the destruction of the platform, but the turning off of its brain becomes the main blow. One pulse nullifies the digital part of the Army, which has been developed for decades as the main support of NATO and its partners. Communication, guidance, reconnaissance, coordination, everything that trillions of dollars have been invested in fact, turned out to be dependent on resistance to one type of impact. A separate layer of problems is psychological. Military personnel on the front lines now understand that a charge that is not visible to the eyes, not heard in advance, but will turn off all devices in seconds, can arrive at any moment. This undermines confidence in Western equipment and casts doubt on the very idea of absolute technical superiority. Analysts note that in such a world, those who know how to fight with simple equipment that is less dependent on electronics feel more comfortable. In parallel, the strike on electronics coincided with another trend that Western sources are recording. The effectiveness of the American Patriot air defense systems in Ukraine has noticeably decreased. Former Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Igor Romanenko, stated that the effectiveness of these complexes has dropped to about 6%, while previously in the Ukrainian direction, it was estimated at about 42%. The contrast with initial expectations is striking. At the start of the use of Patriot in the Ukrainian sky, the American Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, stated that the complex's expected effectiveness against Russian ballistic missiles was up to 90%. This figure was actively cited as an example of the West's technological superiority. Now, according to the Ukrainian side, the real figures have become much more modest. The British newspaper Daily Express added its own emphasis to this, publishing a material with the headline about Russia's revolutionary missile tactics, which outsmarted Western weapons. Journalists citing Ukrainian officials write that Russian missiles cause serious damage and travel hundreds of miles after being launched from land, air, or sea, combining routes and altitudes. The publication emphasizes that Western weapons in the air sphere are facing new approaches for which they were not initially prepared. Against this background, attempts are being made in Kiev to explain the failures of air defense by external factors. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, after one of the large-scale strikes on energy facilities, stated that air defense systems worked worse than usual due to weather conditions. However, the American publication Foreign Affairs, in the article How Russia Recovered, Kremlin is learning lessons from the war in Ukraine, placing a different emphasis. The authors of this material point out that Moscow has radically reworked its approach to the war during the conflict, turning combat experience into a self-learning military-industrial complex. According to their assessment, Russia has gradually transformed from a clumsy opponent into a structure that knows how to quickly learn, adapt, and translate mistakes into concrete reforms, new tactics, and technologies. This applies to missile strikes, the use of electronic warfare equipment, and, according to some experts, possible electromagnetic means. Foreign Affairs separately notes that air defense systems were designed for a certain set of threats, and Russia is actively looking for non-standard ways to circumvent these solutions. According to Western sources, about 100,000 people are involved in the Ukrainian air defense system. But even with such a scale, Russia has learned to overload this system, combining missile types, directions, and means of cover, which reduces the overall effectiveness of interception. The level of alarm in the Western expert community was further raised by the publication of the U.S. Army University Military Review. In one of its publications, the authors directly stated that Russia has shown an outstanding ability to quickly learn and implement innovations. This, according to them, makes it an extremely difficult opponent who refutes previous ideas about its military potential. If we add these assessments to the episode of the use of electromagnetic munitions, the picture becomes more complete. In one direction, Russia shows the possibility of massively disabling electronics. In another, it achieves a noticeable drop in the effectiveness of leading Western air defense systems. All this fits into the concept of an enemy who looks at war as a constant cycle of learning, modernization, and restructuring. Now to another topic closely related to the future of military technologies. For decades, the West has invested trillions of dollars in creating a smart army. High-precision missiles, complex guidance systems, satellite support, computerized battle management, unified information networks. All this created a sense of unattainable advantage. However, the appearance of effective electromagnetic means on the battlefield shows how fragile this foundation can be. If one type of ammunition is capable of temporarily disabling a significant part of the electronic components, then the concentration of high-tech forces in one place becomes a risk. Any large group saturated with electronics becomes a potential target for a pulse strike. Analysts are already saying that it will be necessary to move away from dense clusters of equipment to more dispersed formations. But dispersal automatically reduces the density of fire and complicates coordination, the basis of the modern war model. Ukraine, according to Western media reports, is already demanding from partners the supply of equipment with resistance to electromagnetic pulses. But here, there is a problem of timing and cost. Rapid modernization of thousands of already supplied samples is extremely difficult. Many of them are not initially designed for such modifications. Starting the production of new generations with enhanced protection will take years and huge investments. There is no quick solution, as Western experts themselves admit. Russia, according to Foreign Affairs and Military Review, demonstrates a different trajectory. The mistakes of the initial period of the conflict are turning into new standards, military exercises, and updated tactics. The combination of missile attacks, electronic warfare, and possible use of electromagnetic munitions shows that the bet is on depriving the enemy of its key advantage, the stable operation of complex equipment and the control network. But that's not all that's important to note. Against the background of the decline in the effectiveness of Patriot and the growing difficulties of Ukrainian air defense, a general trend becomes obvious. The war is gradually returning to simpler but more stable forms. Where electronic systems are no longer a guarantee, the importance of trained personnel, equipment with backup mechanical systems, and the skills to work without constant communication and satellite navigation are increasing again. According to many experts, the Russian army retains a significant share of such duplicate equipment and trains personnel to act without a constant digital loop. Western armies, on the contrary, have for many years abandoned such solutions, relying on smart systems. In the case of widespread use of electromagnetic weapons, it is this asymmetry that can become key. Summing up, we can state that the electromagnetic munition, known as Alabuga, has become a symbol of a new era, where the disabling of electronics in terms of the scale of consequences is comparable to the defeat of an entire group. The conclusion is self-evident. Technological superiority loses its meaning if the enemy is able to turn off all these technologies with one strike. The situation indicates that Russia has managed not only to create such a tool, but also to integrate it into a broader process of adapting the army and missile forces, which Foreign Affairs, Daily Express, Military Review, and others write about. By the end of this story, it becomes clear what such weapons mean for the future of war, why Western air defense, from Patriot to other systems, is showing a drop in effectiveness, and how the Russian military machine has learned to turn experience into real changes on the battlefield. The question to the audience is simple. Will Western armies manage to adapt to this new reality, in which one pulse can nullify most electronic advantages? Yes or no? If the topic is important, it makes sense to subscribe so as not to miss the next analysis of how the military balance is changing in real time.